morning. My name is Sarika Devan from UNODC Inehi Center of Excellence. I'm here with Vanda Felbab-Brown, who is a senior fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. Thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Vanda is an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, terrorism, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. And she's just recently published a book called The Extinction Market, Wildlife Trafficking and How to Counter It.
Yes.
So thank you very much again for joining us today. I'm just going to be asking you a few questions on your research on poaching, which is very interesting. So regarding poaching, how is it that this phenomenon has become a problem in the world? And is it that it's just become more evident in recent years because of better measurement or better monitoring?
Well, poaching and wildlife trafficking has gone through multiple waves over many decades. Mm-hmm. The current wave that started perhaps 10 to 20 years ago is one of the most intense waves. A lot of it has centered on the rise of purchasing power poverty among new consumers. Much is centered in East Asia, and so the one aspect of wildlife trafficking and poaching that gets a lot of international attention is the poaching in elephants for ivory and poaching of rhinos for rhino horn. However, those are just two of emblematic species, famous species, among very many species and genera of animals that are being hunted illegally for very many purposes. We are meeting here at a conference in Lima. A lot of the focus has been on poaching in East Asia and poaching in Africa and trade to East Asia. But we are also experiencing likely a new wave of poaching in Latin America. Again, it's a new wave. It's not the first time. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, there have been many instances of massive poaching of, for example, parrots and macaws. New World birds for markets in the United States, in Europe. Lots of that subsided subsequently as a result of new regulations, licensed trade, as well as bans. But there has historically been very massive poaching in Latin America in parrots as well as other species, such as New World monkeys, marmosets, tamarins, for consumption in Latin America. People keep them in pets. Here we are in Peru. There is a lot of poaching of birds, a lot of poaching of snakes, lizards, pythons, New World monkeys for consumption in Peru. People keep them as pets. And so we know that this phenomenon exists, but we have rather poor data on the extent of the phenomenon. And there are suggestions now that what is changing in Latin America, including here in Peru, is that the trade is starting to also develop new routes, new destination, again to South Asia. So here is a very prominent example. Historically, there's been a lot of poaching of jaguars in Peru in the southern cone. And this is done, this is organized by cattle ranchers who hire poachers to eliminate jaguars in order to protect their cattle. Well, what we are seeing now is new wave of poaching. In addition to that driver that has been there, there is a new driver that jaguars are being poached and shipped to East Asian markets where their products are labeled as tiger products and are sold for traditional Chinese medicine. So we have these anecdotal sense, we have these anecdotal bits and pieces of evidence, but we, for example, do not know how many jaguars are poached for the trade to East Asia as opposed to as a result of local cattle ranching.
Mm-hmm. And what, could you tell us a little bit about what types of methods to collect data actually exist on poaching? And is it possible to say which countries have better data and why? Or is it regionally quite similar?
So collecting data is enormously expensive, and often data is not collected adequately. What most data collection focuses on is the seizure of animals that have already been poached. They might be dead or alive. So it's parts of animals that are seized in transshipment places, at airports, at ports, in famous hubs. In Peru here, one of the most notorious hubs for animals that are illegally hunted is Iquitos. And so sometimes law enforcement officials go to these known markets and seize animals there, and they might count, well, this year we have removed from this particular trading hub 40,000 parrots or 40,000 birds, for example. But that's only, so that is one sporadic bit of information on seizures. That's the number that's most frequently recorded, but it's not necessarily recorded systematically. The interdiction seizures are not necessarily frequent, regularly conducted. A crucial issue, however, for measurement, the most important one, is what's actually happening to the wild population of the animal. And that requires very extensive biological research for conservation biologists to conduct regular fieldwork counts. Often there is very little money to support that kind of fieldwork. So what frequently happens is that the fieldwork might be conducted in a year when some grant becomes available, and then 5, 6, 8 years later, no recount has been conducted. And at the end of the day, it's not seizures that matter. The most important factor is what's happening to wild populations. But the financial obstacle is significant. The other important pieces of data are having actually an understanding who are the poachers and who are the smugglers. Often poachers are local people who are hired, but the question is who they are hired with. So traditionally in Latin America, a lot of poaching has been rather disorganized, been conducted by individuals who live close to protected areas or close to areas where the animal occurs, doesn't have to be protected. But now there is the East Asian route that seems to be emerging. Who is behind it? Are these East Asian traders who come with legitimate businesses, who have mining or logging contracts in the Amazon, for example? Are there Latin residents, for example, in Peru or Brazil, Colombia? These are the 3 countries very afflicted by poaching, Argentina also. Are they individuals from these countries who set up the trading networks? What do the trading networks look like? So another very important element of evidence that we do not have, not just the numbers, but what do the networks look like? We don't know that, frankly. We know much more about the structure and the traders and the numbers of animals poached in Africa, particularly Eastern and Southern Africa, and in East Asia. But in Latin America, there is a silent crisis of poaching unfolding that can become much more intensified because of now the renewed integration of Latin America into East Asia. And so much more focus needs to be on poaching and trafficking of wildlife here in the region.
And from an expert like you, it would be very interesting to know what you think countries can do to actually improve their data or improve the measurement of poaching and of those that are involved in it.
Well, the first is to systematize law enforcement and to elevate the importance of the issue for law enforcement. In Latin America, for external as well as internal reason, much of criminologists, many experts on crime, as well as law enforcement agencies are focused on drugs. That's been the predominant illegal economy on which numbers have been, data has been collected, and many different dimensions of drugs. Well, it's important now to start focusing on the wildlife trade because it has devastating consequences for biodiversity. In Latin America, in the Amazon, one of the richest biodiversity hotspot in the world, but there are many other areas like the Altiplano or the Puna, many other special areas with very unique species. So the first starting point is to recognize that the poaching wave has arrived in Latin America. It's never been absent, there's always been domestic markets, but now it's compounded by the global pressures. So to start directing law enforcement to focus on it. To systematize data about seizure is a starting point. there's this great need to develop much more systematic funding, whether from private donors or government agencies, for field counts of populations, of animal populations. There can be much more monitoring of roads that go into the Amazon that are cut, for example, for mining or logging, where information is collected as to how local wildlife markets, illegal wildlife markets emerge. And governments also need to start thinking about who the players are, to what extent, for example, this is driven by subsistent needs. So there are multiple forms of interventions, including on data collections, that government agencies can engage with, but it's not just up to government agencies. There are many NGOs who can enter the space, and criminologists, experts on illegal markets themselves. In Latin America, it's been so focused on drugs. In Africa, there are very many NGOs, very many researchers focusing on wildlife trafficking. That's not been the case in Latin America, and it's very important now for these actors, for non-governmental actors, for researchers, university researchers, also to focus on this issue.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you very much for taking the time, and all the best for the rest of the conference.